Eleanor Taylor of Westminster University, the co-creator of this podcast series, and Professor Colin Chambers. You do feel now, I feel now, that whatever you want to call the left, I don't know if that's the right, it doesn't really exist, but you desperately need it.
Yeah.
Something, because the right they've tapped into something. Simple slogans, rubbish as far as I'm concerned, but make America great again. Dead simple. Yeah, we want that.
Take back control.
Take back control. Yeah, why not? Why not?
Yeah.
Oh, these buggers in Brussels have got it.
Yeah.
The fact they haven't is irrelevant.
Yeah.
That's what it makes people think. Yeah, I'll have some of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the left hasn't got anything. I'm not saying it's as simple as that, but there are. And where do people?
Yeah.
I mean,
the nearest.
But where do you start to find out about the stuff?
Yeah.
I mean, I had to find out. Every generation does. Yeah. But I could do it through people like Jack and Bob and others.
Yeah.
And I, hence writing the Unity book. The people I was with, Red Ladder and all those people in the theatre hadn't got a clue about Unity.
No.
And the fact it was there.
Yeah.
And so, and I wanted, partly not just because I thought the history needed writing, but actually, people need to learn that stuff and then do with it whatever they want. But I know everybody thinks they reinvent, every young generation, and that's. I'm not saying you should stop that, because that's part of the interest, that you've got that curiosity to do it, but then to discover that you're not really actually inventing it is also wonderful. God, somebody thought of that before. Somebody actually said things like that, and I think there's a sort of somewhere a disjoin. All that we went, that was fantastic about the 60s and 70s sort of somehow got buried. I mean, Thatcher buried it to a large extent. That's when our generation sort of gave up after she destroyed the miners.
Most people who have heard of you or have seen your name on books, Professor Chambers, will know you as a theatre historian, fundamentally.
Mm-hmm.
But you are also deeply interested in left-wing politics and history, and also were you a member of the Communist Party at some point?
Yes.
As well?
Yeah.
When did you join?
I think, I'm not quite sure, 1971.
Okay.
I had left school and was at Cambridge University, but wanted to join my local branch where I lived, as opposed to the university one, which was probably a slightly sort of workerist thing at the time, thinking I don't want to just be an intellectual. I want, one of the points of joining the Communist Party was that you had a connection with the working class, or people certainly outside of the academic sphere. And so I joined in North London, where I lived, in Stoke Newington, and I think it was 71, and I stayed until the party dissolved after its battles in the 90s, or actually was it late 80s probably, over, well, very broadly speaking, what was called a Euro-communist wing, and what people sometimes call a Stalinist wing, but I'm not sure that's quite the right term. But I was in what was called the Euro-communist wing and lost. And the party wound itself up. People have an idea of communist parties as being monolithic. In my experience, that's not true, even though they tended to be top-down organisations. When you got down, there were people of the most extraordinary variety, creativity, energy. I mean, the complete opposite of the idea of the sort of, if you like, the robot party member simply following the party line. The whole point about the party line was that it was discussed from the branch level up, and you, at the end of the day, the party made its decision about what it wanted to do, and then, as it were, that was a decision that you all agreed to follow in order to have discipline, and without discipline you wouldn't get anywhere. and that's true if you're fighting a war or whatever. So, but the fact that you followed the party line didn't mean to say you left your brain, outside the front door. And I certainly came across people. Well, I came across people who had left their brain at the front door, and people who, amongst whom, the most exciting people I'd ever come across. So the party was full of, and the Eurocommunist side. But I would say this, wouldn't I? Had people that I thought were the most interesting, and generally thought that their version, if you like, or their interpretation of what it meant to be a communist was about empowering people, was based on democracy at the lowest possible level. So you wanted to involve communities, you wanted to involve. At that time, it was particularly the women's movement was just starting, was strong. So you recognise the power of the women's movement, of anti-racist movements, of the gay movement, and people on the other side who, just for argument's sake, at the moment call them the Stalinists, were much more rigid and much more, if you like, economistic about it. They had a view about the nature of politics, which was a bit more, in our view, two-dimensional. They tended to be people who supported anything the Soviet Union did, whereas the Eurocommunists were critical. I mean, not for the sake of being critical, but were critical of the Soviet Union because they felt it had, in some, well, I'm not saying in almost all respects, was not representing what we thought of as communism. I was at King's College, which was probably the centre of the communist thinking activity at Cambridge, and there were some remarkable people there. We can talk about them if you want, but they were quite inspirational for me, particularly in the economics front. But we had it was an economist called Bob Rowthorne who ran a Marxist reading group, and we read Das Kapital, and I joined that. I just generally found it much more interesting than what I was supposed to be doing in my studies, which is probably quite a lot of people find that. I suppose you call me lower middle class grammar school boy. I'd never come across anything like Cambridge until I went there, and I hadn't even thought about doing that until my school said, "Oh, you should apply for Cambridge." I didn't really know what that meant, and when I went up for the interview, it was the most I don't know quite how to describe it. It was like something out of Dickens, because the interview was in the winter, because you had to stay on an extra term to do Cambridge entrance, and then you got interviewed if you got through whatever the hoops were. And I remember going up to got off the train, got the bus into King's, and it was dark, and I didn't quite know how you got into King's. And the front of King's was all closed up, so I had to knock on this door. And then a little bit of it opened, and a guy in a bowler hat and it was like something out of Dickens or something. And then he opened a bit more of the door, not the whole door. You would sort of step through into a Harry Potter world. It was extraordinary, because there's a building called Gibbs Building, which is the most beautiful Georgian building straight in front of you, and you've got the chapel, which is also the most extraordinary, beautiful building. And I was staying in Gibbs Building overnight. And I'd never been into a place like, when I woke up in the morning and you could see it properly in daylight, and I went into the chapel. I said, "This is just amazing." And I had the interview, and I got in. But when I got there, you soon discovered that almost everybody else, for them, it was just a sort of an ordinary progression through. That's what they expected to do. And they'd all been to these boarding schools. Yeah. And you realised actually how different it was. And I wasn't working class, and that's, I was so low middle class from Tooting Bec in London, in South London. But I'd never come across this sort of thing before. And when we had a sit-in, I remember the people in the, what do they call it, officer training corps, all got dressed up in their army uniform and came to try and sort of break the sit-in.
Oh, really?
Which they didn't manage to do, because we were rather well organised. and the party was pretty important in that. But I remember Eric Hobsbawm came and spoke to the sit-in. And he was really good, because he said, you probably all think of yourselves as rather special, and you probably think you've done something rather clever. Don't. Just ask yourself, come back 10, 15 years and tell me what you're doing. If you're still fighting for something, then fantastic. But I suspect a lot of you won't be. And don't just look back and don't use it as sort of an anecdote to pass on when you're older and you've given up the fight. Which I thought was a pretty sort of cool thing to say, actually, to all these people. Mao was cooler for a lot of people because they thought the Soviet Union had sold out, and the Chinese were really still, real revolutionaries. The fact that what they were doing was pretty unspeakable and caused, I don't know how many millions of people to die, isn't a whole other matter. But it was amongst a certain sort of intellectual strata. Being a Maoist was actually sort of much cooler. You tend to have mostly people who were Trotskyists. So this is probably a bit boring and...
No, go.
People, I suppose, you'd expect a lot of people from where I came to have joined International Socialists or something like that, which was a Trotskyist, one of the Trotskyist groups. It wasn't called to join the Communist Party, really, because that was old hat, and they were supposed to be these sort of, state bureaucracy and all that stuff. And if you were a bit more on the fringe, you could be a Maoist, or perhaps one of the smaller Trotskyist groups, like the IMG, International Marxist Group, which is Tariq Ali's group. Yeah. And I went to a lot of their meetings because I found them intellectually quite interesting, but I didn't actually in the end agree with the politics. Whereas I didn't really get on with their political stance. And although I was quite interested in, I read Mao, but I didn't really take to it. But so the Little Red School Book, which is before I'd done all of that, because I was at school, there was a sort of loose formation, which is sort of, I don't know if it was called the National Union of School Students, but I think it's called that, which was, I suppose, a junior version of the National Union of Students. And they had this publication called the Little Red School Book, and they organised a strike. Okay. And I remember going on strike, and it was the same time, but it was all mixed up in the 60s with counterculture, with rock and roll, with beginnings, although not that open because it was still illegal, of changes in sexuality. I mean, I was involved in the early days of the Gay Liberation Front, and went on, I remember there was a big protest over on called Mary Whitehouse, does that? Yeah. She had a thing called the Festival of Light.
She was the BBC Sunset.
Yes, it was all that stuff, and they had a big rally in Westminster Central Hall, and GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, we organised protests by infiltrating the meeting, and we were all in different parts of the building, and I happened to be in one part where we were all dressed as nuns. Clearly weren't nuns. And the idea was at different points we'd stand up and disrupt it. And I think, I've forgotten the example, I think my lot, we had to shout, "Fuck for Jesus," or something like that, as if we were actually sort of, "Hallelujah, let's..." We did manage to disrupt the whole thing, and because the stewards didn't know how to handle it. The political thing was all bound up with a whole shift in social attitudes and how you saw yourself and empowered yourself. Yeah. And so at school, I remember reading Bukharin, which unbelievably was on sale in the W.H. Smith's in Streatham High Street. At college, I read tons of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and I thought this is what made sense to me. So when I left college, after a pretty... Well, I didn't really do much studying, of conventional studying. I was in a street theatre group in London, lived in a commune in Notting Hill, and we were involved in the Notting Hill Carnival, and that's also when I got involved in a lot of the anti-racist stuff, because the police were very heavy.
To say like a communist student, a good student, wouldn't necessarily apply to you. Have you come across that? Or?
Oh yeah, well, except on the same token, I still, if you were going to be a communist, you had to be better than everybody else at what you were doing.
Yeah.
But to me, that didn't mean passing exams.
I just wanted to ask about sort of the Communist Party when you joined it, what its attitudes to culture were. So you've talked about a lot, really fascinatingly, about things like gay liberation and street theatre. And did you feel that those were quite separate forms of activism from actually being in the party?
Yes.
And did the party see them like that?
Yes, that point, because the street theatre movement was very vibrant at that point. It was really the beginning of it. And they had no clue about their own history.
Well, the theatre movement.
The theatre
right.
movement.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, David Edgar, I don't know if you know of his name, he's quite a big cheese in the left-wing sort of playwriting community. He wrote something like Political Theatre began in 1968, which is one of the reasons I wrote the Unity book, because I thought, I'm sorry, this is just not true.
Yeah.
And so when after I left college, I briefly worked for an outfit called the Movement for Colonial Freedom, which changed its name to Liberation. And then I went from that to the Morning Star. And it was at the Star I started to try and get them to change their cultural coverage and to embrace things like this alternative theatre movement. And I organised some conferences under the Morning Star umbrella of radical theatre groups, and so that was. And at the same time, on the Star, there were people who were interested in the women's movement. There was a writer called B. Campbell, who now quite a well-known. B was on, and she was quite a leading light in Red Rag, and which is a feminist magazine at the time. So it was sort of across borders, if you like, trying to shift the party, because the party as the party really, although they were, I think their view of culture was that it should be available to everybody. So in a sense it was the idea of what we'd call bourgeois culture, if you like, Mozart, Beethoven, Titian, Van Gogh, but everybody should be able to have it, not just posh people. And so they had to have good education so they could learn about this stuff. Then free entry to museums so they could get. It was a slightly mechanistic thing of culture is good. If it's sort of universal values type, humanist stuff, and everybody should be able to have access to it. It shouldn't just be the preserve of the rich or an elite.
What was it like being in the culture group? You said it already existed before you joined.
I can't quite remember. I don't think it had existed, but I didn't discover that until I did some digging around. And it certainly existed just after the war. It may have faded in the early 50s, but I'm not entirely sure about that. And I'm not sure if there are, I suppose there may be records somewhere. But it wasn't, if it did exist, it wasn't active. And I've got a feeling I may have revived it. I certainly became chair of it, but I'm not, and it sounds a bit odd, but I can't quite recall. I was working with a woman called Margot Heinemann, who's, if you've done anything on the Spanish Civil War, you'll know her through John Cornford, and she was at one time with J.D. Bernal, who's one of the great scientific figures. And Margot, in her own right, was a poet and a writer, and also interested in the theatre. But Margot and I can't remember. Margot may have revived it, and I joined it, or I can't remember. But she was on it with me. It was supposed to. I mean, the thing it was supposed to do, when I was in charge of it, was to produce a pamphlet on culture, which I somewhere have all the rough versions of. And we set up working groups on theatre, film, music, libraries, and the stuff that we were doing was actually now very interesting. I mean, Bob Leeson, the person I was mentioning to you, who was the books editor of the Morning Star before me, great friend of Jack Lindsay's, president of the Writers Guild, great children's book writer, and also a writer about trade union history. Bob did a thing on libraries, and this was in the mid-70s, and it was all about making them community resources on a multimedia basis. Opening them up to have music you could take out, having coffee bar, stuff that now people are still vaguely just trying to scrabble around. And it was all good stuff, and the theatre stuff. Anyway, so we had all these little groups, and we all produced better. A guy called Ralph Bond did the cinema one. I can't remember but in the end we found it impossible to agree on a way of unifying it all into a pamphlet, so it never got published.
What was Jack Lindsay working on?
Jack Jack used to read things and tell you what he thought of it.
Because you were the books editor.
I took over from Bob, and that was again a political thing, because in the Morning Star, as like everywhere else, there were factions. And there was, as I said, roughly the Euro-Communist and roughly the other lot. And the editor, when I joined, was sort of probably in the middle, but in his heart probably more Euro-Communist, but wouldn't really let that out. And he supported Bob in what Bob did, and was very supportive of wider cultural stuff in the paper, trying to. And I think the Star was probably the first paper to review the Beatles. We wrote about folk music, we wrote about rock music, we covered gay, positively gay GLF, so with people like B, the women's movement. So it was actually, it was quite. That little bit of it was progressive, but that got up the noses of the people who were the conservative element. And the editor changed, and the editor that I was mostly working under was a much more right-wing, what I'd call right-wing editor, who didn't like all this stuff and wanted it to be much more straightforwardly what he could recognise as being a communist thing. So it wasn't that he was against culture, it had its place, and it was down there in a little box. Anti-racism. I wanted to run a black column.
Yeah.
Because we had a women's page and we had a books page, and I said, well, I don't want a whole page, but I think if you had every week, a column that just dealt with the anti-racist struggle. Oh no, that's elevating it out. It's got to be in its place. This is the sort of base superstructure model, if you like, as opposed to a more organic model of seeing either society or culture. And when I was a books editor, I was always in trouble with him. Because I remember, the biggest one, I think, was when we reviewed a book on the massacre at Katyn in the forest, which I believed was done by the Russians. But that wasn't what you were supposed to put in the Morning Star, And I published this thing, and he didn't know it was going in. And it was a book that said that and was reviewed sympathetically. Actually by a Polish guy who I knew was living in London, and all hell broke loose. And they got a guy called Ivor Montague, who you may have come across, to write a rebuttal of it. And I was told after I had to submit every review to him before they were published. And of course, history now, we know that Montague was wrong, anyway. But so things like that happened, and I'd get books on, it was if you like. I mean, it seems small potatoes now, but it was actually quite important at the time. There was a guy called Roy Medvedev, who was a sort of liberal Russian historian, but a no-no for the sort of certain elements of the Communist Party, who was a friend of Sakharov. Is that dissident? So he's Andrei Sakharov. There was a whole sort of dissident movement. And
where were they living?
They were still in Russia.
Still in Russia, but
Yeah. Oh, there were some that had moved out. I mean, had gone into exile, like the poet Joseph Brodsky, who I met, and I was 100% on the side of the dissidents. Whether they were right-wing people or not, like Solzhenitsyn was bonkers in my view. But that wasn't the point. He shouldn't have been treated as he was. That was, and so the books page tried to express that, and there was a lot of tension. So in terms of the party in culture, the party sort of recognised it was important, but didn't really know how to actively engage with it. The same with Unity. When Unity, I mean, the leading people were in the Communist Party, but lots of the activists might have supported it, but weren't necessarily party members. But then the party didn't really want to have any, because it was a problem. They didn't quite know how to handle it all. Emil Burns, we might have tried to, after the war, lay down the line on what culture should do, but of course it doesn't work. And if you've got the sort of people who were, if you look at the people who were in the Communist Party who were writing about culture and were themselves poets, novelists, there's no way all those people are going to be, as it were, corralled. Patrick Hamilton. You look at what Patrick Hamilton writes. That doesn't figure in Emil Burns's world at all. And then with Patrick Hamilton, you've got the sort of the sexuality issue as well, because that's a complete no-no. And I was in a World Youth Festival in Berlin Red Ladder was there, which is alternative theatre, and a guy, Peter Tatchell. Do you know Peter? Peter came with me. And Peter then, was giving out leaflets about gay rights this was in East Germany, and he was being followed by the Stasi all the time, and then we were on a beach by a lake, and he was giving out more leaflets, and then all of a sudden you've got all these youngsters in their uniforms, sort of the uniform of the youth movement, came and took all, one way they all took his leaflet. This is a bit odd, and they formed a circle around him, and then the leader came and he lit them. So it was a bonfire, which of course has echoes for anybody who. And then we had to because I was with Peter at the time, we had to get him off the beach before he got beaten up. Okay. But the people who actually beat him up were on the British delegation, who were in the Communist Party. He carried a placard on the final demonstration. It was torn down by other party members. And
do you remember what was written on the placard?
Somewhere I've got a photo. It was very, very mild, but anything with gay in it was just. And I remember having to go to party headquarters when I got back to tell them what had happened, because it was another party member who'd done this, and he was something I know, he was NUS secretary or something, quite a big cheese, and he got, I don't know, sanctuary. But so there were the cultural. There were no. It was all sort of cultural politics was part of sexual politics, was part of politics. I mean, that was the whole. The personal was political, but the political was personal. It was the whole thing, and so we tried to reflect that in the Star, which we did. But then, of course, the Star. When the battle between the Eurocommunists and the Communist Party decided it didn't approve of what the Star was doing, and the Star then went, because of historical reasons had been set up as a separate entity, the Star broke away from the Communist Party, and then the Communist Party dissolved, and it became the paper of I think it's now called the Communist Party of Britain.
I was under the impression that it was the Daily Worker somehow morphed into... It did,
into the Morning Star, yeah.
Okay.
They changed, that was part, if you like, that was a good example of a Euro-communist move. Because the editor I said, who was sort of a bit in the middle, but privately probably Euro-communist, he was the one behind the change of name. And the idea was that Daily Worker was a bit too hammer and sickle, and you wanted to get a broader readership. So he got the name changed. Dame Sybil Thorndike pressed the button to get the presses rolling for the first Morning Star. So you get, Sybil Thorndike, cultural icon. So culture was, and George, who was the editor, was he thought his favourite composer was Shostakovich. He's a great opera man as well, and he often used to write the opera reviews under a pseudonym, not always under a pseudonym. So that he was, they were cultural, but then the new editor wasn't at all. He was. So it's a sort of a complex relationship, and the cultural committee group never had any power at all of any sort. And the party actually, after Unity, decided not to really get involved. But it was, there were rows, as you all know, with our time. The whole what happened during the war, the whole issue of the party and the Soviet line with Stalin hitting the pack. And the General Secretary resigned when he lost that vote. So there were a lot of, it's a complex. And then he comes back when Nazis invade the Soviet Union, and so the change of line again. Yeah.